Hi, hello. This is Kate in Houston. Welcome to today's conversation with Dr. Raymond L. Johnson. Dr. Johnson made history as the first Black student who was admitted to Rice in 1963. At that time, a group of white alum sued to stop him and all the other Black students from going to school. Fortunately, the Board of Trustees fought the lawsuit and won. So Dr. Johnson went on and became the university first Black graduate. Today, we're very fortunate to have him with us. We will have a conversation about that, his life and with the Rice University. I will give you a little bit context of our conversation because last year, November of 2021, the Board of Trustees of Rice University selected the first Black president for Rice University. Because of our audience, a lot of them are Rice students, parents, and alumni, also potential Asian students and students from Asia. I myself is also a Rice alum of 2019. So, and last year, December of 2020, Rice University Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Justice did an interview with Dr. Raymond. Dr. Bird and Ms. Mance did a great job at that time, and they put the video on YouTube as well. So I will try not to duplicate their content, but rather build upon their work. So thank you for joining me in our channel and let us have an opportunity to speak with you, Dr. Raymond.
Okay.
So first, would you please just give us a highlight about your life?
Well, so I was born in a small town, Alice, Texas, which is about 200 miles southwest of Houston. I went to an all-Black school for the first 8 years. It's called Carver Elementary. It was 4 grades in one room, 4 grades in another room. And then after you finished the 8th grades, you would catch a bus and be taken to Kingsville because there weren't enough Black students in Alice to have a high school of its own. So they paid Kingsville to let the Alice students, Black students from Alice, go to Kingsville's high school. So now, as I mentioned one other thing to you, that my grandfather, actually he's my step-grandfather, my grandmother remarried after her husband died. He was a preacher, and so he certainly knew how to read the Bible, at least, and he saw that I was curious about reading, so he taught me to read when I was very young. When I went to school, they skipped me from 1st grade to 3rd grade. Now that's relevant later on because when I went to high school, so in 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education was decided, the Alice School Board decided to stop paying Kingsville to send their students over to Kingsville, and instead decided to admit Black students to school in Alice. So in 9th grade, I went to DuBose Junior High School. And then 10th, 11th, and 12th, I went to the regular high school in Alice, William Adams. So I didn't have to ride the bus 28 miles.
I see.
So that's the background to get me to high school. Now, when I was in high school, I took a standardized test, some type of a test, I don't know what, but the counselor, Mr. Brooks, saw that I did very well on it. And so he called me in and basically put me on a college track, which until then I had no idea what a college track was. But him and Mr. O'Rear, who was the science and math teacher, were the biggest influence on my life and doing well in high school in Alice. And then eventually, when I graduated, I actually went to the University of Texas, which is where Mr. O'Rear was working on a master's degree.
I see. Yeah, some of the information you have spoke during the previous interview, as I mentioned, did by Rice University. So, well, I just asked some questions based on that interview. So, you mentioned you were the first generation in your family going to college, right? Yeah. So, how did you hear about college and eventually even applied for a Ph.D. program?
Well, so again, it's a 2-step process. Mr. Brooks is probably the first person who ever said the word college to me because, Alice is a very small town, 21,000 people. My plan for getting out was that I was going to get out of high school, join the Army, and leave Alice. That had worked for some of my cousins, and so that was a plan that I thought would work. But then Mr. Brooks was the first person who suggested the possibility of college. Now, what happened was I took standardized tests and I didn't do very well. And so he pointed out that since I had 2 years advantage in a sense, if I spent 1 more year in high school and really worked on my English, there was a chance I could get a scholarship and go to college. So I tried that and it worked, and I got a National Merit Scholarship. Now, the National Merit Scholarship could be held anywhere, but I chose the University of Texas because Mr. O'Rear went to Texas and he knew someone who taught there. He was working on his master's degree with Dr. Curtis. And there was also a student at Alice named Ann Cooper, whose uncle taught at the University of Texas. So I thought, at least if I go to Texas, there'll be some people I know. Now, unfortunately, Ann Cooper's uncle was killed the summer before I got there. He was changing a flat tire on the interstate highway, and he was, hit and killed. But I did contact Dr. Curtis. Dr. Curtis is the one who then he gave me reading courses. He did that frequently. It needs a little bit of explanation. Texas was very, very bifurcated, okay? There was an applied math department and there was a pure math department. And the two didn't mix. And so if you were an applied math student, you couldn't take pure math courses because they would look at you with the evil eye. If you took, or a pure math student, you were not allowed to take applied math courses. I mean, Dr. Moore was the head of the pure math department, and he insisted on certain courses that you had to take if you were a pure mathematician. So Dr. Curtis, to avoid this, basically had me do a reading course with him on calculus. So I did 2 years of calculus with him, and then I went into the regular classes at the University of Texas. But that was because of the split between applied and pure math, and he was considered to be an applied mathematician, although given what he did, it would really be considered very, very pure by most of us today. But then while I was with Dr. Curtis, he's the first person who told me, when I was getting toward the end of my 3rd year, I actually managed to finish in 3 years because of the extra courses I had taken at Alice. And he suggested that his alma mater, which was Rice University, was getting ready to desegregate. He also told me that he was going to be spending a sabbatical there. That means he would be spending his year leave there. So at least there'd be somebody there that I knew. And so a friend of mine drove me down to Houston, and I went to Rice and looked over the campus and decided to try it.
I see.
You said I was the first student. So there were actually 3 students admitted that year. This was in 1963. And the suit stopped all 3 of them from coming. But at the next year, in 1964, after the university had won, all 3 of us were admitted. They finished, but they didn't finish at Rice.
I see. So you mentioned that these teachers in Chinese culture, we call 贵人, the people who help you, or like angels, to help you along. So I heard Stan Brooks, that's your high school counselor, and then Mr. Larry O'Rear, that's your high school math teacher.
Yes.
And also Dr. Curtis.
Howard B. Curtis.
Yeah, that's your professor at UT
University
at the
Texas,
time.
Yeah.
And then he came to Rice, and then you follow him along.
And I would add one more person who was, I didn't know him at the time, but he was the chairman of the math department at Rice when I got there. His name was Jim Douglas, and he was quite a character as a Texan, but he's the person I chose to work with as my Ph.D. advisor. And he was also very influential in my life. I could tell you about him many stories, but okay.
Wow. Well, it seems like the educators and teachers in your life make the big difference in each turn of life. They made a huge
difference, and that's why I try to make the same kind of difference with other students if I can. They made a big difference.
I see. Yeah. I mean, I am an educator. I taught school before, and many of our audience also teachers. I guess it helps to help us to know, something we did and can change people's life. And in Chinese culture, they call teachers the engineers for souls because they can make a big change in people's life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So. Then in the Rice interview, you mentioned a few incidents. Well, first, of course, the school, to getting into a school as a Black student is very difficult. And then you were living in an apartment and was kicked out from the apartment. I also mentioned going to a restaurant, that there was difficulty for Black to get into restaurant. So all these, you talk about it as a matter of fact, I guess part of American history. I read the history on paper, but some of our audience, like international, they are not very familiar with that background of American history. Could you just elaborate on that? What is the background about that? Just all those incidents that happen.
Well, I mentioned a few things, like, for example, the fact that the schools were segregated until 1954, including in Alice, Texas, where I grew up. When I got to Houston in 1963, as you said, the restaurants were still segregated. The Civil Rights Act had passed in 1963, but in fact, even though it was called the Open Accommodations Act, there were many restaurants that chose not to follow the law. And in fact, there was a Rice student named Diana Cole who decided to organize a group of Rice students. And TSU is a Black college in Houston. So basically, she got a group of Black students and a group of white students. And we would, quote, test whether or not the Open Accommodations Act was being enforced or being accepted by the restaurants. So there would be two of us, one from TSU, one from Rice. So one Black student, one white student would go to the restaurant and try to have dinner. And usually we would get kicked out. But occasionally, you know, there were some restaurants. I mean, there was a Mexican restaurant in the Village, which is near Rice University, that admitted everybody. But many of the restaurants at that time in 1963, 64 were still not living up to the law. And so that was one of the things that you know, we did at Rice to find out what was going on. There were also protest marches downtown because the things were still segregated. My wife was more political than I was. She wasn't my wife then, but you know, we got married later on. And so she took me to a lot of those protests. In fact, the one time that I saw Dr. King was he spoke at TSU, and she was a student at TSU. So she took me over to hear him give a talk.
Wow.
So the civil rights thing was all in the background. In fact, one of the things I've sometimes wondered is when I found out that the alumni was suing, that I couldn't go to school right away, why did I decide to stay? But I think I felt that because of the civil rights era that was going on, Rice would probably win, but you know, it was no guarantee. And it took a year for the matter to be settled.
I see. Yeah. As you said, even the law has, you know, has established and passed, but still some people resist to follow the law. Yeah. Wow. That's really, this our audience are saying this is a very difficult situation. Imagine that. But in the previous interview and here you speak as just kind of like a matter of fact, I guess. How could
you know, the thing is,
it's like so injustice.
I mentioned to you, you know, I grew up with it, and so things are so much better that I guess I tend to focus on the fact that things are so much better. Now, things are not ideal. I mean, there are still situations that go on. We just had the George Floyd incident. We have many other incidents like that. There are instances in which, you know, people, for example, when I was growing up, the way that people stopped you from voting was there was a poll tax. A person had to pay. My uncle had a receipt. My son has a copy of it. It was $1.75, which is about the equivalent of $20 today, that you had to pay every year in order to vote. And so, you know, there were these things that happened. That was declared unconstitutional about 1964. So I know things where things have improved. I also know things where things have more or less stayed the same. And I guess I've just tried to look on the bright side. I certainly never expected when I was a student at Rice that we would have a Black president or a Black president of Rice. And both of those have happened in my lifetime. Wow,
yeah, that's really amazing, just how society has been transformed. It's really, impressive. So you also mentioned in the previous interview, in spite of what's going on in the larger society, you were happy in the math department. Can you explain more about what contributed to your happiness there, or why you had a good time?
Yeah, okay. So that's an interesting thing that I've thought a lot about, which I'm not sure if I'm right about, but you know, the two students who entered Rice at the same time as I did, both graduated from college, but neither finished at Rice. They lived in the dorms, which with the Rice students, and there were some Rice students who were very accepting of the idea of integration, and there were some who were very opposed to it. And so I guess I've always felt that they were in the midst of so many people, some of whom really didn't want them there, that they had a difficult time adapting. I was a graduate student. And so 8 to 5, 5 or 6 days a week, I was at Rice. I was in the library, I was with the other graduate students, I was doing whatever graduate students do. Sometimes we work and sometimes we don't, sometimes we play. But then in the weekend, I could go home. I would go to Third Ward. I would be in the Black community. I could relax, I could be myself. And so I felt like, the 2 days off really helped me, whereas the poor students who were on campus had to live with being the first student all the time. And I felt that weekend was really significant for me. And the evening too, also, because I could go to the Third Ward to eat dinner and things like that. I had to.
Oh, so you have a community in a way.
I had a real community. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Whereas they had a community that the colleges are a very close-knit community, but I can imagine that it was difficult for the Black students breaking in to get into that community, which I didn't have to do.
And that's I remember some of the Chinese students, when they went to Midwest, small town, for college, they felt very isolated, difficult to be there. But in a bigger city, like in Houston, there is a Chinatown, Chinese community. These international students, at Rice or other universities, they could go there, get a Chinese meal or something, usually were helpful for them to adjust.
In fact, one of my closest friends in graduate school was a Chinese student named Cheng Char Tu, who had gone from mainland China to Taiwan, and then he came to the United States to do his undergraduate work, and he came to Rice to do his PhD. He was a little bit older than the rest of us, but he was extremely wise, and so he was somebody that I listened to. Now, I don't remember that many Chinese restaurants that he took me to then, but later when we both had graduated, he got his PhD and went to Case Western. I got my PhD and went to University of Maryland. Then he got a job at the Census Department and came to Washington. And then he took me to many good Chinese restaurants. So. Oh,
that's great. Yeah, I mean, math, Asian and Chinese, a lot of Chinese studied math. So yeah, you made a good Chinese friend. I'm glad to hear that.
It sort of made me a little unusual though, because for example, I do remember while he was telling me about when China took over Tibet. Now remember, he had escaped from communist China and gone to Taiwan, but he told me, Tibet used to be a province of China. And so, I had a very different attitude about the Chinese takeover of Tibet than a lot of Americans, because he told me something that historically I would not have known otherwise.
Oh, yeah, that has been a big controversial in the West.
Sure.
I'm glad you get to hear the part of the history.
I heard a different point of view. Yes.
Yeah, wow. So in the Rice interview, it said that you wrote to the university president at that time about your concern, prepare for future Black students, and then get more students to Rice. So I guess then, in 2020, in the context of George Floyd, President Lee Brown and Provost DeRoche wrote to the Rice community, announced the 5 actions they were going to take, including creating a new position of Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So now 50 years has passed since you graduate. What do you see in terms of progress in terms of integration or accepting Black students, just in this regard?
Well, so there are a lot more Black students than there were when I was there. I was only one of 3 at the time that I was there, but now there are many more Black students. I haven't kept up exactly with everything that's happened since then. I did go back in 2012 and I taught for 5 years. And so I saw that there were many more Black students on campus at that time. I left before Provost DeRoche came, so I didn't have a chance to meet him. But I did notice that when Rice set up the Vice Provost for Equity and Diversity, one of my colleagues from that time, Alexander Bird, who was a professor of history, was named Vice Provost. So, I was happy to see that. And I think they've made progress. Now, I mentioned that I had an issue with the math department, which I have since gotten over. But I was the first student to get a Black student to get a PhD in math at Rice. I was also the last Black student to get a PhD in math at Rice. But I said that in the interview with Dr. McDaniel, and the chairman of the math department contacted me and let me know that they were working on trying to remedy that. Wow. And in fact, I think they've recruited a very good student. And so we have hopes that in the next 2 or 3 years, the second student to get a PhD in pure math will happen at Rice University. So I think they're making progress. It's certainly not the kind of environment that I went into back in those days. And you should bear in mind, even though there were students who were very much opposed to the idea of integrating Rice, there were a lot of students who accepted. The Thresher editorial had written several times calling on Rice to desegregate. So there was student support for it, but there was also student opposition to it.
I see. Yeah, the people who are making difference. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
and the board of trustees actually decided on their own that William Marsh Rice's will had called for them to create an educational institution of the first rank that was for white citizens of Texas. Now, they had realized that they could not hold on to the citizens of Texas many years before. In fact, I think that had been annulled back in the 40s. But then they finally decided that, in fact, if they tried to continue just as a university for whites, that federal funding wouldn't be available and the university couldn't be a university of the first rank. So again, you have a contradiction between this founder's will. He wants two different things, but he can't have both. And so they decided that they would keep education institutions of the first rank. And fortunately for me, the court agreed with them.
I see. Yeah. So the people who guarded Rice, I guess the board really make a right and good decision at that time. Yeah. So yeah, last year the board of trustees make another big decision in appointing the first Black president of Rice. So what would you hope or expect this president coming in and doing things, or in terms of diversity and advancement of the university?
Okay, so I think his number one job is to make sure the university remains a university of the first rank, but I'm sure that he will also keep an eye on maintaining the commitment to education, to diversity and inclusion that has gone on since the time that Rice started. So I'm looking forward to both, but I realize his primary job, as with Rice's will, is to maintain an institution of the first rank and then to do all the other things that go along with that.
Yeah, well, a lot of people really have big hopes for incoming president. Well, hopefully.
Well, I have been at two institutions now which have had their first Black president. When I was at the University of Maryland in about 1980, the first Black president of College Park was John Slaughter. And that happened while I was at the University of Maryland. Now, University of Maryland has gone on, and now they have the second Black president, Darrell Pines, who's an engineer. So, I hope that Rice will do the same thing. I mean, they'll have some good presidents of all races from now on. Yeah,
wow, that you did. Not only you made the history, you also witnessed a really amazing history too.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, as a recruiting student, that part, you were the chairman of mathematics department at University of Maryland. What would you say in terms of recruiting Black students for math or even science? There are some people say they have difficulty, or what was your experience or in this regard?
So my experience is complicated. When I was a young assistant professor, they had recruited some Black students to the math department in Maryland, and they asked me to help them. And I did my best. But one of the things I realized was a lot of the students' background was not what Maryland needed. And so I gradually withdrew myself from that opportunity, from that option, until I became the graduate chair myself, which was about 1988. And then I started to recruit students myself. And I remember very well, because the first student the first year I was there, I had a student, and I just really didn't feel that this student was good enough. He would succeed in the program in Maryland. And so I turned him down. And I had to tell myself that I'm turning him down for a good reason. I can find somebody better.
You're turning down a Black student?
Yes.
Wow.
I had to. And so, that happened to me several times. I mean, I remember one time there was another student I was having difficulty with. And I went to one of our alumni who had been successful, a Black student who had succeeded in a Ph.D. program at Maryland. And I told him I was really struggling with this guy because, on the one hand, his grades looked very, very good. But on the other hand, his GRE was like at the 12th or 15th percentile. And the guy looked at me and he said, I was at the 89th percentile of the GRE, and I had hell at Maryland. And you're thinking about this? And so I realized he's absolutely right. Sometimes you have to say no. Now, so that's one thing, okay? The other thing is, though, that when you say yes, you do need a faculty that's willing to see that the people you said yes about deserve to be in Maryland. So story that I had here, I had the first student I recruited, a very good student that I recruited. And I thought she was one of the best students I'd ever seen at Maryland. We had this strange system, ABC was the rating for financial aid. And she came back rated as a C. Now, C meant you would not get financial aid. A's and B's got financial aid. This is the best student I've ever seen, Black student I've seen. So I went to the chairman at the time, Nelson Markman, and I said, look at this. I don't know, what should I do about this? He said, look, send it over to the Graduate Fellowship Committee on campus. We had a committee that looked at all of campus to award fellowships. He said, we have more experience. We're used to seeing people more broadly. So send it over to us. I sent the file over to them. Even though she had been rated C by the math department's committee, she was rated A by the graduate student financial aid committee and given a fellowship, which is even better than an assistantship. So then when I took that back to the graduate committee, they said, oh, okay, they gave her an A and they gave her an assistantship. But it was like, they did not believe that she was as good as I saw. But when the campus committee saw it, they saw something different. Now, I still think that's a problem because we had a number of students where you see an issue that you just don't understand. I had a student that the colleague at the university said, this is the best student I've ever had. And he called me up and he said, I don't understand what's going on. This is the best student I've ever had. And yet every place he's applied, he's been turned down for financial aid. So I walked downstairs. I was chairman at that time. And usually I didn't look at the committees. We had graduate chairs who looked at that. But I went down to look at his folder. And when I looked at the folder, he had 2 excellent letters of recommendation. He, and notice I said he, right? The third letter said, I know Dr. Mr. So-and-so, I mean, Mr. So-and-so very well. She is an excellent student. Now, how can you say that he is a she unless you're really trying to sabotage the person? So I called a colleague back and I just asked him, could you get another letter? He got a third letter. We gave the student an assistantship. The student came to Maryland and got a Ph.D. So you had sabotage in a sense. And when the colleague said that the person who had written that letter had something against him, but the point is, you had people who were evaluating what they saw in the files. It's just that what was in the files wasn't accurate. So there are all sorts of things that can happen. And I think the main thing that I say that I did and that people who've been successful in recruiting African Americans to graduate school have done is pay attention. Just look at the small things like that and you can find out what's really going on. And then if you admit the students who are suitable for your program, a good number of them will succeed. Now, some of them didn't succeed. And I took each of them who didn't succeed very personally. I felt very bad about it. But unfortunately, you hope that you can get an 80 or 90% success rate, but you get whatever you can get in terms of the best success rate. Now, and I will also say that after I stepped down as chairman, the program continued on momentum for a while, but then I think they stopped paying attention. And really now the program is just like any other program in the United States.
I see. Yeah, sounds like you really pay attention and went off your way to really seek out for the good students.
Yes, sometimes when you have to do that. I mean, another thing that we did was, when the Black students arrive on campus, they're very aware that they're in a certain different kind of environment than what they've been in before. And in fact, one of the students said to me very well, she said, we don't mind playing by the rules, just let us know what the rules are. So one of the things that I did also was they know that, we have to get on with these white students because they're the majority of the classmates. But they sometimes didn't realize that they should also form a community of Black students. And so what we helped them do with some help, a lot of help from them, was to form a community of themselves so they could talk to the white students, they could talk to the Black students, they could talk to the Asian students, and they could participate in the whole community and feel comfortable as a part of the whole community, and not just, feel like they're isolated because they're Black and therefore not part of the larger community.
Right, to organize together and to share with each other. Yeah. So also, in the whole race issue is sometimes would you think by having a diverse faculty being on a team can provide some unique solution to some issues,
Well, I think it would help, but like I said, unfortunately, we didn't have that in Maryland. I was the only Black faculty member for many years. We got another African-American faculty member, African faculty member shortly before I left. But for many, many years, I was the only African-American faculty member. So you have to sort of have this work even in all that situation as well if you're going to have to be successful in the long run.
Yeah.
Like, for example, at Rice now, I believe there's one African-American faculty member who has tenure. So, again, you're not talking about a large group. It would be good if you had more than one, but you have to play with the team you've got.
Yeah, that's true. And in a lot of, I guess, last year, I'm going to read one of the editorial from Houston Chronicle when they announced the news of Rice's selection of the first Black president. It reads, Rice's selection of DeRoche is a vivid and most welcome testimonial to the powerful currents sweeping the nation, forces that have institutions large and small, new and old, reevaluating how they contribute to ending the racism still present in American life. Well, as you said, in department, there's still only one faculty that seems need a little bit more development there. But
well, again, but I should point out another thing, though. I mean, people may not be as familiar with some of these details as I am. There is a pure math department at Rice, and there is an applied math department. It's called Computational and Applied Math. And actually, when I was there was only the one. So there was one department that had both pure and applied math within it. It's one of the things that attracted me to Rice compared to Texas, because in Texas, like I said, there was this bitter war between pure and applied. But at Rice, there was just one department. But then Rice decided to split into two. And actually, CAM also has a Black faculty member and has produced many of the Black students who have gotten PhDs from Rice since I was a student there. So, if they had been one department, then we would have twice as many faculty members and would have produced more PhDs. But because of the split, that's one of the reasons that it looks a little bit different than it did when I was a student.
I see. Yeah. Well, thanks for adding that. Well, it's great that I guess society making more progress in terms of having, Black and Asian and other students on campus that did add diversity and the culture to the university, and people can learn from each other and prepare them for the real world students when they get out of the university. Yeah. So thank you so much for having this conversation with us and add a lot of details to your life story and the stories back in those years. We really appreciate your time. And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.